Good afternoon and welcome to God's Answers to Your Questions, the Wednesday afternoon edition. I apologize for the delay in getting live and getting on here. I messed a couple things up behind the scenes, but I got it all fixed now. If you have questions or comments on today's show, you can reach out to us on my page, Christian Application Ministries. I shared there God's answers to your questions, or my YouTube channel. But without further ado, let's introduce our panelists. Joining me today is Simon Harris. How you doing, Simon?
Doing all right, CJ. Good to be with you today.
Good to be with you. Sorry about the delay, Simon. Well, we are going to be in Hosea, but let's first go to God in prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for this day. Thank you for everything you've given us. Please help us as we study today to glean from your word the truth, Father. We love you, Father. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Well, Simon, go ahead and get us started.
All right, so we're in Hosea chapter 8. For the last couple chapters, God has been laying out his case against Israel. Israel is guilty of spiritual harlotry, and now is time for them to pay the punishment. And so last week in chapter 7, he talked about how they were like a silly dove chasing after Egypt and Assyria. And so in this chapter, they're going to be punished. And lo and behold, in the next chapter, we're going to even find out that it's going to be by Assyria, who they've been chasing after. In this chapter, what God is going to do is he's going to announce the judgment. So again, the case has been laid out. He's going to announce the judgment, and then he's going to tell them what's going to happen as a result of their sin. And we're going to come across another pretty familiar passage, another pretty familiar idea in the book of Hosea, and we'll have more to say about that. If we have time at the end, we can talk even more about it. We'll see. But verses 1 through 3 is when the judgment is announced. So I'll go ahead and read those verses in the New King James. It says, "Set the trumpet to your mouth. He shall come like an eagle against the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law. Israel will cry out to me, my God, we know you. Israel has rejected the good. The enemy will pursue him, and the enemy will pursue him." So Hosea is told to announce the alarm. It's kind of interesting, isn't it, CJ, that he says, set a trumpet to your mouth. Because you think about when we even hear about the second coming of Jesus. Now, again, this isn't directly tied to the second coming of Jesus or anything, but with the second coming of Jesus, there's going to be a trumpet sound, right?
Right.
And so the idea is it's over. It's too late. It's here. But the trumpet here really also is the idea of calling in the enemy. So back in those days, when the army was going to move, a certain trumpet sound would play, and the army would know it was time to move. And so that's what's happening here. Is Isaiah? I don't know why I said Isaiah. Hosea, I guess because it sounds so much like Hosea.
Right.
Hosea he's calling in the one who's coming to destroy Israel. And again, we know that that is going to be Assyria. And they're coming like an eagle. When you think about the idea of them coming like an eagle, like what kind of imagery does that give you? What's the idea of them coming like an eagle?
Well, the idea is they're gonna swoop in and take you. Eagles are predators. Uh, they're
Yeah,
gonna take you away.
yeah, that's it. I think about the idea of fast and no defense, you know, against it. And he tells them the two reasons, still in verse 1, why they are going away. And what's his two reasons there in verse 1?
Well, they first transgressed his covenant, and then they rebelled against his law.
Yep.
Which really, I see that as one and the same. I don't know what the difference would be if there is a difference. But maybe the idea of saying something twice is really emphasizing, look, you messed up, you transgressed the covenant, my law you broke.
Yeah. They are one and the same, but I think we're supposed to see just a slight difference between the two ideas. Think about this. Um, what was Gomer to Hosea?
His wife,
And what was Israel to God?
his wife
And
is
what have they done?
broken the covenant.
Yeah, they've chased after other gods. So they had this agreement between them that I'm going to be your God and you're going to be my people. And they're not keeping that agreement. But then God had also given them a law because he's the Lord, right? And so he'd given them a law that
Right,
specifically told them how to behave. And they have rebelled against that. By the way, you remember back in Deuteronomy, Moses told the children of Israel that God's laws were not burdensome, that they were for their good always. And so they've rejected that. And so if they've rejected what is good for them, what can they expect?
right.
That's it.
Judgment.
Yeah, that's it. So he says, so here's the enemy's coming. They're swooping in on them. And Israel's going to cry out to me, my God, we know you. And it's like, they're like, God, what are you doing to us? And this is just so typical of people. So they've transgressed the covenant. They've rebelled against God's law. And now when it comes time to pay the price, they're like, God, what are you doing to me? Why are you treating me like this? And I just think about how often I hear this. People who haven't paid the slightest attention to God and his law, haven't at all tried to be what God would have them to be. But then something bad happens in their life and like, why is God doing this to me?
That's right.
And that's exactly what Israel is doing here. And in this case, God has been trying again and again and again and again to get Israel not to do this. And so for them to cry out, it's almost like a spoiled child.
Right.
And and it's just like how ridiculous it really is. And he
This
says, so Israel has rejected the good. And I think that goes right back to what I said a moment ago from verse 1. But, we know that God is good. And so they have detested the idea of what is good. So they have rejected everything that God stands for. And because of that, the enemy is going to pursue them.
it's their fault. They can't blame it on God. God, you made me do it, or it was the devil, or he, we never agreed to this. They couldn't throw that up in God's face, because if you remember in Exodus 19 and 20, after God lays out all the conditions, The people consented and said, "All that you commanded us, we will do." If they didn't agree, it would not be a covenant.
Right.
A covenant is made between two mutual agreeing parties. And so they're the ones that transgressed and fell and disobeyed.
That's it. That's exactly right. All right. So since they have transgressed the covenant and rebelled against the law, there are some results. And so the first set of results is in 4 to 6. So why don't you read that for us?
They set up kings, but not by me. They made princes, but I did not acknowledge them. From their silver and gold they made idols for themselves, that they might be cut off. Your calf is rejected, O Samaria. My anger is aroused against them. How long until they attain innocence? For from Israel is even this. A workman made it, it is not God. But the calf of Samaria shall be broken in pieces.
Okay. So he says they have set up kings, but not by me. Now, remember this, he's talking about the northern 10 tribes of Israel. So when Israel was united in the days of Saul, David, and Solomon, again, God didn't want them to have a king. They asked for a king, and God gave them a king, and he gave them Saul. And then he set up a king after his own heart, David. And then Solomon was also appointed as king by God, and so was Rehoboam. But Rehoboam was given a condition, and there was another man who was actually a servant of Solomon named Jeroboam. And so God actually set him up. I'm just really condensing the story very quickly. The kingdom divided during the time of Rehoboam, who was Solomon's son. And God actually did give the 10 northern tribes to Jeroboam. But since then, Jeroboam's line, his dynasty, was murdered off and replaced by another dynasty. That dynasty was murdered off and replaced by another dynasty. That dynasty was murdered off and replaced by another dynasty. So now these people are so far removed from the king that God gave them that they can't even remember how they got there. That's how bad off they are. And so God doesn't acknowledge these kings. They're not legitimate kings in Israel. But it's interesting because he talks about the fact that Israel has made idols for themselves, because what that first king that God did give the 10 tribes to, Jeroboam, what he did, he changed the religion, right? He set up these golden calves. And so in verse 5, he said, "Your calf is rejected, O Samaria." Now that's kind of interesting because Jeroboam set up 2 calves. You remember where they were?
One at Dan and one at Bethel.
Right. And so Dan is way up north and Bethel is to the south. And so some scholars think that by the time Hosea is writing this, Dan has already been captured and that calf has been taken away as spoil. And so the only calf left is in Beersheba. No, not Beersheba. What's the other one? Huh?
Bethel.
Bethel. Yeah.
Man, Simon, are you already losing it?
And well, sometimes these details get confused in my brain if I haven't actually studied the details in some time. Hey, I'm not perfect. I don't have perfect recall like some other preachers that I know. I have to rely on hard study.
We're not the apostles for sure.
That's exactly right. But it also, he may be referring to the calf as one, this false god, even though there's two idols of it set up. But interesting, because in verse 6, where it says the calf of Samaria is broken to pieces, that word pieces there can mean splinters, which is, again, a cool connection, because the first time they made a golden calf was back during the time of the Exodus, and God had Moses crush it into powder and threw it into the water and made the people drink it, and so now this calf is going to be destroyed to that same level. But I want to back up to two things. In verse 5, I want you to notice it says, how long until they attain to innocence? The New American Standard says, how long will they be incapable of innocence? And so here the idea is that they will not return. They will not repent. So in verse 2, when they cried out, my God, we know you, they're claiming that they're innocent. They're claiming that they have this relationship with God, but they've broken it. And so they can claim to know God, but their actions show that they don't know God. And they have no basis to stand on, because they're not even trying. How long will they be incapable of innocence? And so they're beyond hope. They will not change. And so that's what's going on here.
The same principle rolls over to the New Testament. Jesus teaches us, if you want to have a relationship with me, in John 14:15, keep my commandments. And then 1 John says, he who says, I know God, like Israel's doing, we know God, but does not keep his commandments. 1 John tells us that he is a liar and the truth is not in him.
That's exactly right. The other thing that I want to point out is in verse 6, he says, a workman made it, and it is not God. We cannot create, man cannot create something that is even truly intelligent, much less a God, and that's exactly what they've tried to do. So they dress up this piece of wood with silver and gold and call it their God, but it can't be God. It's a creation, not a creator. The only God, the only true God, is the only true creator. So if it can't create, it can't be God.
That's right. And then I think of passages where God makes fun of these false gods, and there's a passage where God says, they have eyes, but they can't see. They have ears, but they can't hear. They have noses, but they can't smell. You're worshiping a block of wood that you want 1 minute, chopped it down, the next minute you're worshiping it. A part of you, God, is sitting in your house as a couch in modern day language,
Yeah,
and then another part you're bowing down to.
that's right. It's kind of ridiculous, and we think we're so much more modern than that, and we don't worship idols, but we worship just as many dumb things as they worshipped.
That's right.
All right, so 7 to 10 contains this next result, and it contains a passage that will sound really familiar to us. So I'll read that. They sow to the wind and reap the whirlwind. The stalk has no bud. It shall never produce meal. If it should produce, aliens would swallow it up. Israel is swallowed up. Now they are all among the Gentiles, like a vessel in which there's no pleasure. For they have gone up to Assyria like a wild donkey alone by itself. Ephraim has hired lovers. Yes, though they have hired among the nations, now I will gather them, and they shall sorrow a little because of the burdens of the king of princes. So the phrase that we hear a lot and from Hosea here is they sow to the wind and they reap the whirlwind. The idea of sowing to the wind really is the idea of, just throwing your seed up in the air. But it's also just the idea, again, it's kind of an idiom. And the idea is that they've made these changes. They've made what seems like insignificant changes. It's just like wind. But yet they're going to reap the whirlwind for those changes. And the whirlwind is a tornado. So, this is one of those true principles about reaping and sowing, right? You always reap more than you sow. So here they're sowing a little wind and reaping a tornado. And the idea is they're not going to survive. They think what they've done is insignificant, but it's not to God. It's a major deal to God.
Right.
He says, what you have sown in the fields, it's not going to bud. And even if so if it doesn't bud, it can't produce grain. It can't produce flour, flour, as we say in the South. Even if it did, aliens are going to take it away because that's what they do. That's what Israel does. They use all of their grain and everything to hire these lovers. And so that's what he's saying. Kind of reminds me of the story of Gideon when we're introduced to him. The Midianites, and this is hundreds of years before Hosea, the Midianites have invaded the land and they take everything. So much so that Gideon is hiding in a wine press in order to thresh out some wheat so he can have some bread for the day. That's how bad things are. And so that's what he's kind of hinting back to that idea here. And he says, so Israel is swallowed up, just like a twister, swallows up a trailer home in the trailer park. That's really kind of of course, there weren't no trailers or trailer parks in those days, but you know what I'm saying.
Right.
And now they're among the Gentiles, and they're a vessel that has no pleasure. So nobody really likes them. They've gone up to Syria like a wild donkey alone by itself. This is interesting. Ephraim has hired lovers. Normally when a man goes to a prostitute, he pays the prostitute, right? In this case, Ephraim is the prostitute paying the men. How ridiculous is that? And so he's really mocking Israel here. They're looking for lovers and they're paying lovers. I mean, what kind of a harlot does that? That's just ridiculous.
Right.
Is what he's getting across. So in verse 10, you think about a whirlwind scattering things, and it says they can scatter themselves among the nations. And the idea is that they're going to flee from God and try to hide among the nations, but God is going to gather them up. In other places, God talks about gathering the people up from among the nations to bless them, but not here. God is gathering them up out of the nations in order to punish them.
I wanted to point out that in verse 8, when he says Israel is swallowed up, now they are among the Gentiles, they have lost their distinctiveness. that they're among the heathens of their day. They're not God's holy people anymore. And that's a lesson for us. We're called to be just as different as Israel was back then. And if we're not careful, we can just blend in the world and not be different. Uh, think about this. God gave them a holy law, holy precepts, holy priest, a holy tabernacle, a holy temple eventually, but they're still no different. They may look different because they say, we're offering sacrifices still, we're doing what we're supposed to, but really, they're acting the same way
Yeah.
as other nations.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent observation. That takes us, right back to what he said in verse 2. They've transgressed the covenant. They rebelled against the law. So they're the two things that made them special. And so they've rejected what makes them special. And so you're absolutely right. So now they're just like everybody else. They're just like the Gentiles. And so God is treating them just like he treated the Gentiles, the enemies of his people.
But
That's an excellent point.
and not only do they not look like God's people, they're being overtaken by ungodly people. It's one thing just to be in your own little circle, doing what's wrong. It's another thing to do what's wrong in your nation and invite everybody in to party with you. And so God's people are now recognizable, and the question is, are we recognizable to God? Is what I'm doing in my life uh, making me different, making me the same to the people in the world?
I think that's right. I think that's something we got to think about. All right. So in 11 to 13, we have a third result. So is it my turn to read, or is it it's your turn to read? 11 to 13.
Because Ephraim has made many altars for sin, they become for him altars for sinning. I have written for him the great things of my law, but they were considered a strange thing. For the sacrifices of my offerings, they sacrifice flesh and eat it, but the Lord does not accept them. Now he will punish their iniquity and punish their sins. They shall return to Egypt.
Okay. So Ephraim has made many altars. So they're trying to be spiritual people. They're trying to increase their spirituality, but they're increasing their sin.
Right.
There's only supposed to be one altar in all of Israel, and that was in Jerusalem. That was going to be the place where God put his name. So there's only one altar. So every other altar they built after that was a sin. So every time they offered a sacrifice on that altar that was the false altar, they've sinned. And so what this kind of reminds me of is there are some people who think, any religion is fine. Any religion is just as good as any other religion. Well, that sure sounds good. And, we'd like that to be true, but that's not what God says. God says, no, they have increased their sin by increasing the number of their altars. So when God says there's one way, there's only one way. And we can't come along and say, well, yeah, but I'm doing all this good over here, You know,
That's
I'm
right.
still sacrificing. I'm still doing this. No, because you're not doing it according to God's law. And so that's what he is saying to them. And so he even tells them that in verse 12. You know, the New King James says, I have written for him the great things of my law. The New American Standard says, though I wrote for him 10,000 precepts of my law. And it's not that there's 10,000 laws that they have to follow. The idea is like, I've told you 10,000 times what my law is. That, you know,
Right.
so everything was spelled out for them. There was no question about what they were supposed to do and how they were supposed to do it. They've just rejected that. So once they've rejected God's clear-cut instructions, again, there's no hope for them as long as they continue in that. And again, I just cannot help but think about the world we live in today. You know, it's kind of like the days of Judges when everyone did what was right in the sight of his own eyes. People today think they can decide how to worship God, and then God just has to accept that. But he doesn't. And that's what he's saying right here to these people.
You know, I often ask people, or I've heard it asked, if you go to all this trouble to worship God, doesn't it just make sense to give him what he asked for? Going through all this trouble to try and approach God, it just makes sense to give him what he asked for. Instead of throwing your fist up saying, You you get what you get, God. This is what I'm gonna offer you. Really? Is the God of the universe gonna accept that? You get what you get, God? Really?
Indeed. And you notice about God's law, they considered it a strange thing. And again, I just think about how many people have such a negative idea about this word. You know, we're backwards, we're stupid, we're whatever negative thing you want to say because we try our best to follow this book, to follow this word that we've been given.
Remember in 1 Corinthians what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1 about how the cross of Christ is foolishness to those who are perishing. It's foolish. Well, if I can be my own God, if I can do my own thing, why do I need to obey God? I'm my own God. So that's just foolish. There's no logic. I mean, science have tried to disprove God for ages now. But every time they tried, it just keeps confirming the Bible.
Indeed. Indeed. In verse 13, for the sacrifice my offering, they sacrifice flesh and eat it. So the idea there is that they're only practicing their religion for what they get out of it. And again, man, isn't that a common problem? And, you know, a lot of times when we talk about problems, we talk about these mythical people who exist out here somewhere. But I'm going to tell you what, this is true with so many people who go to church and even people who would go to the churches that you and I would feel comfortable going to, that there's a lot of times all people are thinking about when they come to church is what I get out of it. And if I don't get out of it what I think I should be getting out of it, then I don't want any part of it. Now, again, I'm not saying that there isn't a benefit for us to come to worship God together, that we should be edified. And certainly, if a church is doing things that are wrong, then we have to consider that. But you know, sometimes it's like if we come to church and a guy leads 4 songs that are scriptural, and they teach and everything. But if he leads them off key, or if he leads them slow, then all of a sudden, oh, I didn't get anything out of that. Or if the preacher wants to step on toes, oh, well, I didn't get anything out of that. And so, again, I'm not talking about maybe legitimate things that we should be concerned about. But listen, the best way to get from church, worship service, what you should get is come to worship God, come to give God what he has demanded and what he's worthy of. And then I promise you, you will leave feeling edified and built up.
So in verse 13, I was wondering, is this because the priests were the only ones authorized to eat the meat that was sacrificed, right?
No, not always. There were times when the people brought like peace offerings that they got to share in the peace offering. So there were times where they got to eat part of it. But think about this: they're offering worship to a false god, and God doesn't accept that. They're going to altars that they shouldn't be using, and so that sacrifice on this false altar, this false god, isn't doing anything for them. And so all they're getting out of it is the meat. And that's really the idea is that's really what they're interested in. They're really bringing the sacrifice so they can eat meat.
So it's just cooking. They're not
Yes.
sacrificing.
That's exactly right. And for Americans, because we eat so much meat, and because we're so rich, eating meat doesn't seem like a big deal. But like in the times where I've gone to India or to Africa, they don't eat as much meat because it's more expensive. But so if you can offer a sacrifice and look good in front of your community, but what you're really doing is just filling your own belly with meat, which you don't get very much, then you can kind of see where that's coming from. So they're looking religious, looking really spiritual, but they're really just interested in eating meat. And so because of this, they're going to be punished. They're going to go back to Egypt. And Egypt is being used here metaphorically. This was the ultimate enemy. This was the ultimate place of their captivity. So they're really going to be taken into Syrian captivity. But the idea of going back to Egypt is to be in captivity. It's just like if I were to call you Benedict Arnold, you would know I'm calling you a traitor,
Right.
All right, I'll read verse 14 because he has been talking to Israel. But in verse 14, he wants Judah to know they better be concerned as well because they're just as guilty. He says, "For Israel has forgotten his maker and has built temples. Judah has also multiplied fortified cities. But I will send fire upon his cities, and it shall devour his palaces." So Judah, at least in this illustration, because Judah had a problem with idolatry as well. But the thing that God is attacking here is that Judah is relying on fortified cities to stand against Assyria. So Judah is relying on themselves, on their own power, is the idea. And so he's saying, look, you can't trust your fortified cities. Just like Israel can't trust their false gods, you can't trust your fortified cities. So God is going to destroy all of them and burn them to pieces, or burn them to the ground. So I told you, and so real quick, I just want to do something. We're over time, really. We're supposed to stop 5 minutes ago, but we were late coming on today. So I want you to think about putting this reaping the whirlwind into kind of a modern idea. So in verses 8 to 10, he talks about them chasing after the nations around them. So the wind that they sowed is with the wind of friendship with the world. And so they're going to reap the whirlwind when the world turns on them. And that's something you've got to remember. The world is not your friend. The world doesn't want you as a friend. The world's going to spit you out, eat you up, and spit you out. And so that's number one. So then the second thing we see in verse 11 is this idea of false spirituality. So they're worshiping so many gods, offering so many sacrifices to these gods, but they're useless. And so those gods aren't going to be able to help them. Third, they're really worshiping themselves, right? We talked about that. They're really worshiping because of what they get out of it. And what they get is a full belly that's going to be destroyed. So, if you die in battle with a full belly, so what? It's kind of a thought. And then in verse 14, the wind is self-reliance, relying on themselves. And I'm going to tell you something. I really think that's a big problem that we have as Americans. We think that America is strong enough that we don't have to worry about anybody else, but God can bring us down in just a short time.
That's right.
So if we're going to reap, if we're going to sow to the wind, we can expect to reap the whirlwind.
That's right. Well, thank you all for joining us. And I think next week we'll be off because Simon won't be here, and I'll wait to continue this study in Hosea with Simon when he gets back. So there won't be a program next week, but you can still submit questions or comments on Facebook and my YouTube page, CJ Marshall. Thank you all, and we'll see you in a couple weeks. God bless.